Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading of Tyler's Row by Miss Reed. Peter Hale is beginning to take an interest in the available properties at Tyler's Row. Masters and Jones estate agent's office presented a fine Georgian front, all red brick and white painted sash windows, to Caxley High Street. It looked what it was, a long-established, prosperous family business which had served Caxley and its neighborhood well for 4 generations. William Masters had founded the firm in the year of the Great Exhibition of 1861, and 3 of his descendants were still active in the firm. Clough Jones, a foreigner from Pontypool, joined the firm in 1920, and so was a comparative newcomer to Caxley. His beautiful tenor voice was soon taking the lead in Caxley's operatic society, and he was reckoned to be a very steady sort of chap. Some added, for a Welshman, in the year or 2 after Clough's arrival, but this proviso was soon dropped, proof that he had shown his worth. Peter had taught 2 of the master's boys and Clough's only son Ellis. It was the younger of the master's boys, now a man of 28, who welcomed Peter to the office and set a chair for him on the other side of the desk. The interior of the house was disappointing. The large square rooms on each side of the hall had been divided into 4, with partitions of flimsy wood topped with reeded glass. Occasionally one would catch sight of a head, curiously distorted in the next compartment, elongated like a giraffe woman's from Africa, or bulging sideways like a squashed Christmas pudding, according to the angle of the glass through which it was visible. The floors were covered with linoleum of a pattern purporting to be wooden blocks. As these were of such unlikely colors as pale blue, orange, and pink, the effect was unconvincing, and to Peter, eyeing it distastefully, thoroughly shocking. "Very nice to see you, sir," said young Masters deferentially. It seemed only yesterday that he was waiting outside the detention room door under Mr. Hale's stern direction. Something to do with the unification of Germany and Italy, if he'd remembered correctly, had brought him to that pretty pass, and now he came to think of it, he was still not much wiser on the subject, detention or no detention. But he had always felt a healthy respect for old Hale, and even now a slight tremor affected his knees at the thought of past bondage. "I've come about this property at Fairacre," said Peter. He looked over his spectacles at the young man. David, Paul, John, what the deuce was the boy called? "Can't remember your name, I'm afraid," he added. "Philip, sir." "Ah, yes, Philip, second 15 fullback. Well, no, sir, that was my brother Jack. I wasn't much good." "Forget my own name next," replied Peter cheerfully. "Well, I'm thinking of going ahead with Tyler's Row. Better have a survey, sooner the better." "Yes, indeed," said Philip with more confidence. "You will certainly need to get moving, sir. Another gentleman is being rather pressing." Peter Hale looked sternly across his spectacles. "Is this the truth?" Philip was instantly transformed into a wrongdoing first-former, despite his 6 feet of height. "Yes, sir, honestly, sir," he heard himself saying nervously. Heavens above, his voice seemed to have become treble again. He took a grip upon himself and cleared his throat. Damn it, this was his office, wasn't it? A gentleman already resident in Fairacre, living in or resident, if you must," corrected Peter automatically. Philip, clinging to his precarious confidence, ignored the interruption. "He's very interested in the property and has already had it surveyed. I think it's quite likely he will make us an offer, probably in advance of the selling price." "More fool him," said Peter flatly. "I'm not bribing anybody." Of course not, sir, but I should advise you to get a survey done immediately. I could go out myself. Do that then, Philip, will you? I'll just jot down one or two reminders. He pulled a sheet of paper towards him and began to scribble diligently with his left hand. Terrible writing that boy always did, remembered Peter, watching his old pupil at work. Felt sure he'd be a doctor with that scrawl, but not enough brains, really, nice fellow though he was. He looked at the bent head, the beautifully clean white parting, the well-shaven cheeks, and felt a warm glow. Should be able to trust him. Solid chap, nice family, respectable firm. Why, young Philip might bring Tyler's Row to him eventually. He was smiling when the young man looked up. "You'd be happy there, sir," he said, stating a fact, not asking a question. "I think we should," agreed Peter. He rose and went to the door, his gaze on the linoleum. "Who chose this?" he asked, pointing with a toe. "I did, sir," said Philip proudly. "Pity," said Peter in farewell. Chapter 4. Mrs. Pringle Smells Trouble. Who's to be the new owner of Tyler's Row? This was the question which exercised the minds of his future neighbors in Fairacre. Henry Maughan had been the favorite for so long that it was something of a shock to learn that he had retired from the race and that an outsider was the winner. The news came to me from Mrs. Pringle during the summer holidays. She spends one morning each week putting me to rights, as she says, and although her presence is more of a penance than a pleasure, the results of her hard work are excellent. I try to do any of my simple entertaining on Wednesday evenings. It is the one day in the week when the place really shines. "That sitting room of yours wants bottoming," said Mrs. Pringle dourly. This, construed, means that a thorough spring cleaning was considered necessary. "Looks all right to me," I replied, quailing inwardly. Mrs. Pringle, bottoming anything, is one of the major forces of nature, something between a volcano and a hurricane, and certainly frightening and uncomfortable. "Seems to me you just lays a duster round when you feel like it. That side table's a fair disgrace, all over hot rings where you put down your cup, and ink spots no honest woman could get off." "Well, I sometimes," I began, but was swept aside. The hurricane was gaining force nicely. Mrs. Hope, poor soul that she was a stickler for doing the furniture right. Every piece was gone over once a week with a nice piece of soft cloth wrung out in warm water and vinegar. When Mrs. Hope's example is invoked, I know that I may as well give in. She lived in the schoolhouse many years ago. Her husband is remembered as an unsuccessful poet who drowned his sorrows in drink and was finally asked to leave. But Mrs. Hope has left behind her a reputation for cleanliness as fierce and unremitting as Mrs. Pringle's own. "Mrs. Hope didn't have to teach all day," I said, putting up a poor defense. "Mrs. Hope," boomed Mrs. Pringle, "would have kept her place clean and taught. Nothing slipshod about Mrs. Hope." "You win," I said resignedly. "Shall I make coffee now?" Mrs. Pringle inclined her head graciously. "And put it on a tray. I've enough marks to rub off the table as it is." Over coffee, she told me the news. "Mrs. Maughan put her foot down, so I hear. Never liked the idea of moving, so Mrs. Willett said. Her sister was doing a bit of efflery for her." "A bit of what?" "Epholstery, covering chairs and couches and such like. Well, as I was saying, Mrs. Maughan told her plain that they had looked at Tyler's Row and decided against it. She'd decided, she meant. Anyone could see the poor old gent would have loved it." "So it's on the market still?" Mrs. Pringle swelled with the gratified pride of one about to impart secret knowledge. "I been told, by one who should know, that Mr. Hale from the grammar school's having it." "Probably just rumor," I said offhandedly. A cunning move this, to learn more, but I smarted still under the threat of being bottomed. Mrs. Pringle rose to the bait beautifully. Her wattles turned red and wobbled with all the fury of an enraged turkey-cock. My John's sister-in-law cleans at Masters and Jones, and she's seen Mr. Hale in and out of that place like a whirligig. And what's more, he's been to Tyler's Row himself nigh on half a dozen times in the last fortnight, fair bristling with foot rulers and pencils and papers. He's having it all right, mark my words. Well, well, we'll have to wait and see, won't we? I said, with just a nice touch of disbelief. Anyway, he'd be a pleasant neighbor. Respectable, agreed Mrs. Pringle, accepting a second Garibaldi biscuit graciously. Friendly, too, they say, though he fair lays about those boys, from what my nephew says, if they don't work. I'm glad to hear it, I said. He sounds a man after my own heart. When's he coming? You tell me, replied Mrs. Pringle emphatically. He's got an architect and a builder, so between 'em both, that'll hold things up. The architect was out doing what Mr. Willett tells me is a survey, though he saw young Masters doing one too, a week or so back. Shows he's serious, doesn't it? Having two people look at it, I mean. She dusted a crumb or two from her massive bosom and rose to continue her labors. If he's in by next spring, he'll be lucky, she foretold gloomily. And then I wish him joy of his neighbors, poor soul. I confess that the future of Tyler's Row did not concern me greatly, although I have as keen an interest in village affairs, I think, as most people in Fairacre. But I had troubles of my own at this time, as well as the intimidating prospect of Mrs. Pringle's bottoming in the near future. I was also threatened with the formation of a parent-teacher association at Fairacre School. For generations, any association between parents and teachers has been a natural one, sometimes enthusiastically cooperative, sometimes acrimonious according to circumstance. But always it has been of an informal type, and it has worked very well. I don't mind admitting that I am a non-committee woman. The very sight of an agenda fills me with dreadful boredom, and all that jargon about delegating authority to a subcommittee and forwarding resolutions to this and that renders me numb and vague. The thought of an association which met once a month and involved speakers and demonstrations and general sociability filled me with depression. It would mean yet another evening away from my snug fireside, sitting in the drafty schoolroom and acting as reluctant hostess to a bevy of parents whom I saw quite enough of in any case. The moving force behind this activity was a newcomer to the village, Mrs. Johnson. The family had moved into a cottage in the village street once occupied by a lovable slattern called Mrs. Emery and her family. Mr. Emery had worked at an establishment some miles away known to us as the Atomic. Mr. Johnson also worked there and was a somewhat pompous young man of leftish tendencies who had some difficulty in finding cruel masters grinding the faces of the poor, but lived in hope. His wife, rather more militant, held strong views on education. She brought 3 young sons to the school soon after the summer term started. They were pale, bespectacled children, fiercely articulate, in contrast to my normal, placid pupils, but quite amenable and keen to work, and got on very well. But their mother was a sore trial. She met them at the school gate every afternoon and buttonholed me. I was subjected to tirades of information, usually faulty, on such topics as the dangers of formal teaching, the necessity for monthly intelligence tests, absolute freedom of thought, word, and deed for each child, and, of course, the complete rebuilding of Fairacre School. There are very few teachers who welcome this sort of thing at 4 o'clock in the afternoon after a hard day's teaching. My civility soon grew thin, and I was obliged to tell her that any complaints must be dealt with at an appointed time. After this I had fewer face-to-face encounters at the gate, but a number of letters, badly typed on flimsy paper and running to 3 or 4 pages, setting forth half-baked theories on education bearing no relevance that I could see upon present circumstances. Unfortunately, Mrs. Johnson and Mrs. Maughan became close friends, and Mrs. Maughan is one of the school's managers. Whether she was still smarting from the wounds inflicted in the Battle of Tyler's Row, from which she had emerged the victor, I shall never know. But certainly, soon after Mrs. Pringle's conversation, the pressure for the formation of a parent-teacher association was intensified. The vicar, who is chairman of the managers, mentioned the matter on several occasions. I really think it is unnecessary, I told him yet again. Fairacres managed very well without one, and it's going to be a real headache finding something to do regularly every month or whenever it is proposed to meet. If I felt that the majority of parents wanted it, then I'd submit with good grace. But I feel sure Mrs. Johnson's at the bottom of this, and I don't suppose that family will stay in the village any longer than the Emerys did. I give them 2 years at the most. The poor vicar looked unhappy. We have a managers' meeting tomorrow, and this is one of the matters to be discussed, as you know. I did not, as a matter of fact, as the notice had been thrust unread behind the clock on the mantelpiece, from whence I should snatch it 1 minute before the meeting. Do consider it, my dear Miss Reed, said the vicar, his kind old face puckering with anxiety. And what does Mrs. Bonney think about it? I realized with a shock that I had never even thought of consulting Mrs. Bonney, the infants teacher, about this possibility. This was remiss of me, and I must put the matter right without delay. When the vicar had gone, his cloak swirling in the fresh summer breeze from the downs, I made my way to the infants' room where Mrs. Bonney was walking among her charges' desks, admiring plasticine baskets of fruit, crayoned portraits of each other, notable for rows of teeth like piano keys, and inordinately long necklaces of wooden beads which trailed over the desks like exotic knobbly snakes. It was a peaceful scene, and Mrs. Bonney, a plump pink widow in her 50s, added to the air of coziness. Very nice, I said to an upheld blue banana. Beautiful, I said, to a picture executed by one of the Coggs twins, showing her sister with one mauve eye, one yellow, and a mop of what appeared to be scarlet steel wool at the top of the portrait. By this time, every piece of work in the room was raised for my inspection and approval. Wonderful! Very good effort. Lovely beads. Neat work. You have tried hard. The comments rattled out as evenly as peas from a shooter. Then I clapped my hands and told them to continue. Sweets for quiet workers, I added, resorting to a little bribery. The vicar's been talking about this idea of a parent-teacher association, I began to Mrs. Bonney. A bright smile lit her face. It's a marvelous idea, isn't it? She exclaimed enthusiastically, and I felt my spirits sink. All the Caxley schools seem to have them, and the parents are wonderful, always raising money for things and in and out of the school helping, you know. My face must have registered my misgivings, for she gazed at me anxiously. You don't think it would work here? She queried. There was a pause while she darted to the first row and ran an expert finger round the inside of a child's mouth and removed a wet red bead. That would hurt if you swallowed it, she said sternly, and what's more, she added practically, we're very short of beads. She turned to me. Sorry, Miss Reed, what's your objection to a P.T.A.? I told her somewhat lamely, I felt. It was quite apparent that she was strongly in favor of setting one up, and I could see I was going to be heavily outnumbered. I think you would find it a great help, she assured me. I'd welcome it myself. She stopped suddenly, and her pink face grew pinker. But there, I might not be here to enjoy it, she said, looking confused. Novelists talk about a cold hand gripping their heroine's heart. 2 cold ones gripped mine and fairly twisted it into oblivion. The thought of losing Mrs. Bonney and all that entailed, the succession of supply teachers, if any, or, much more likely, the squashing of the whole school into my classroom for me to instruct for some dreadful interminable period, froze my blood. It has happened so often before, and every time, it seems, is more appalling than the last. Mrs. Bonney, I said in a voice cracked with apprehension, what do you mean? She rearranged her pearls self-consciously, slewing them round with energetic jerks to get the clasp tidily at the nape of her neck. I was going to tell you on Friday, said Mrs. Bonney, to give me time, I thought despairingly, to recover from the news during the weekend. I'm getting married again, in the Christmas holidays, in fact. I professed myself delighted. and waited for a bolt from heaven to strike me dead. "A friend of my husband's," she said, warming to her theme. "He's always been so close to our family. In fact, he's godfather to my boy." "Well, he's jolly lucky," I said, and meant it, stopping a string of beads which a boy was whirling round and round in a dangerous circle and getting a bruised hand in the process. The occupational hazards of an infants teacher are something which would surprise the general public if explained. "I don't want to give up teaching, at least for some time. We want to save as much money as we can for when we retire. Anyway, I should miss the children terribly." "Well, that's a relief," I told her. "We thought we'd see how things go. Theo says that if I find it too much, I must stop, of course, but I shall stay as long as I can." "Let's hope it's for years," I said. "So you see," concluded Miss Bonnie happily, "although I think the P.T.A. is a marvelous idea, and I think you will too if it happens, Miss Reed, I won't press you one way or the other because it won't really affect me, will it?" "No," I said morosely. "I quite see that." I renewed my congratulations, smiled brightly upon the infants, and returned to my own classroom. There I found that the children had put away their work, books had been stacked neatly on the cupboard, the large hymn book had been propped upon the ancient piano in readiness for next morning's prayers, and all that the class awaited was the word to go home. Certainly the clock's hands were at 5 to 4, but I felt slightly nettled at such officious timekeeping. The children, however, arms folded, stout country boots neatly side by side, were so pleased with their efforts that I had not the heart, broken-spirited woman that I was, to chide them. They sang grace lustily and then tumbled out into the lobby while I locked my desk. An ear-splitting shriek, followed by a babble of voices, took me to the lobby in record time. Mrs. Pringle, broom upheld like Britannia's trident, gazed wrathfully upon the horde milling round her. "If I'm laid up tomorrow," she boomed, "I lay it at the door of that boy." She pointed at Joseph Coggs, whose dark eyes looked piteously toward me. "Stepped full on me bunion with his great hobnail boots, enough to cripple me for life." I looked at the terrified Joseph. "Have you said you were sorry?" "Yes, miss," he whispered abjectly. Mrs. Pringle snorted. For some unworthy reason, my spirits rose unaccountably. "Ah, well, Mrs. Pringle," I said with as much gravity as I could muster, "we all have our troubles. And we'll find out more about the troubles to come next time."